Strip that dress, prove you're no fraud. Eleanor Whitmore's voice sliced through the glittering Grand Opal ballroom, her finger jabbing at Michelle. Beneath the chandelier's radiant glow, Michelle, a stunning black woman, 7 months pregnant, stood radiant in her white satin off-shoulder gown, its soft puffed sleeves framing her elegance. Yet Eleanor's accusation unleashed a storm. Before hundreds of elite guests, she tore Michelle's dress, exposing her pregnant belly in a cascade of shredded satin. Michelle's defiant cry, "You have no right!" echoed, her eyes blazing. A shattered glass broke the stunned silence. Who orchestrated this public shaming? Will Michelle's billionaire father Isaiah unleash vengeance? Will justice prevail? Stay riveted to uncover a tale of betrayal, redemption, and unbreakable resilience. The Grand Opal ballroom shimmered like a jewel box, its crystal chandeliers casting prisms of light across polished marble floors. Golden champagne flutes clinked in the hands of New York's elite, their laughter a brittle mask over whispered rivalries. At the edge of the crowd, Michelle stood, a vision in her white satin off-shoulder gown, its delicate puffed sleeves framing her like fragile wings. The dress clung to her 7-month pregnant frame, accentuating her curves with a soft, luminous grace. Her long, straight hair cascaded down her back, a dark river catching the light. Yet beneath her poised exterior, her heart thrummed with unease, each beat a reminder of the child stirring within her. She was a black woman in a sea of white privilege, the outsider who had dared to marry into the Whitmore dynasty. Every glance from the guests felt like a needle, pricking at her resolve. Eleanor Whitmore, the matriarch of this gilded empire, glided through the room, her silver gown trailing like liquid steel. Her sharp blue eyes, framed by a pearl choker, missed nothing. She was the queen of New York's high society, a woman who wielded power like a blade, and tonight her gaze lingered on Michelle with a venomous edge. Michelle's fingers tightened around her glass of sparkling water, the cold rim grounding her as she sensed the storm brewing. She had read the morning's gossip column, a vicious lie branding her a fraud who had swindled an art charity. The words had burned into her mind, each syllable a calculated strike. She knew the source was no accident. Eleanor's shadow loomed behind it, a mother-in-law determined to protect her family's legacy from the woman she deemed unworthy. Daniel Whitmore, Michelle's husband, stood across the room, his tailored tuxedo accentuating his broad shoulders. His charm was effortless, a smile flashed at investors, but his eyes avoided hers. Once, those eyes had held promises of love, of a future where race and status didn't matter. Now they carried a flicker of cowardice, a man torn between his wife and his mother's iron grip. Michelle's chest tightened, a pang of betrayal mingling with the ache of her pregnancy. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling a gentle kick, a silent vow to her unborn child. "I'll protect you, no matter what." But the room seemed to close in, the air thick with unspoken judgments. Eleanor's voice cut through the orchestra's soft melody, commanding attention as she ascended the small stage at the ballroom's center. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone smooth as silk but sharp as glass. "Tonight, we celebrate the Whitmore legacy, a beacon of honor, philanthropy, and tradition." Her eyes swept the crowd, pausing on Michelle, a smile curling her lips like a predator's. But legacies are fragile, easily tarnished by those who bring shadows. The word hung in the air, heavy with intent. The guests turned, their gazes pinning Michelle like spotlights. Her breath caught, the weight of their scrutiny pressing against her ribs. She wanted to shrink, to vanish, but she forced her chin higher, her dark eyes meeting Eleanor's with defiance. Whispers rippled through the crowd, a venomous hum. "Did you read the article?" one woman murmured, her diamond earrings glinting. "She's trouble," another replied, sipping champagne. Michelle's fingers trembled, the sparkling water threatening to spill. She knew Eleanor had orchestrated the rumor, a calculated move to isolate her, to ensure the Whitmore fortune remained untouched by her child's claim. The thought twisted in her gut, a mix of anger and fear. She was more than a scandal, more than the outsider they painted her to be. She was a mother, a wife, a woman who had fought to belong in a world that never welcomed her. Vanessa Reed, Eleanor's sleek assistant, materialized at Michelle's side, her crimson gown a stark contrast to Michelle's white satin. Her smile was all teeth, a predator cloaked in politeness. "Michelle, darling," she purred, her voice dripping with false concern. "Your gown looks off. A stain, perhaps?" "Eleanor insists we fix it before the photographers swarm." Michelle's eyes narrowed. Her dress was pristine, the satin flawless under the chandelier's glow. "It's fine," she said, her voice steady despite the pulse hammering in her throat. Vanessa's grip on her elbow was firm, guiding her toward the stage. "It's for your own good," she whispered, her tone laced with menace. "Eleanor wants a word." Michelle's heart sank, but she followed, her heels clicking against the marble. The crowd parted, their eyes trailing her like vultures circling prey. She felt the baby kick again, a small surge of strength that steadied her. "I won't let them break me," she thought, though the air grew heavier with each step. Daniel watched from a distance, his jaw tight, but he didn't move. His silence was a blade, cutting deeper than any rumor. Michelle's throat burned with unshed tears, but she swallowed them, her pride a shield against the room's hostility. As they neared the stage, Eleanor descended, her silver gown shimmering like a storm cloud. The orchestra faded, leaving a suffocating silence. Michelle stood before her, the satin gown catching the light, her beauty a stark contrast to Eleanor's cold elegance. "Michelle," Eleanor said, loud enough for the front rows to hear, "you've brought quite the spotlight tonight." Her smile was a blade slicing through the pretense. "Some stains can't be hidden, no matter how fine the dress." The crowd's murmurs grew sharper, a chorus of judgment. Michelle's hands clenched, her nails biting into her palms. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat, trapped by the weight of 100 accusing eyes. Vanessa leaned closer, her breath hot against Michelle's ear. "Don't make a scene," she hissed. "Eleanor only wants to protect the family name." The lie was blatant, a mockery of Michelle's pain. She glanced at Daniel, hoping for a spark of courage, but he turned away, adjusting his cufflinks as if the moment were nothing. The betrayal stung, a raw wound that made her vision blur. She thought of her father, Isaiah, the man she hadn't spoken to since her marriage. He had warned her about the Whitmores, their world of power and prejudice. Now standing alone, she wished for his strength, his unyielding resolve. Clara Vaughn, a sharp-eyed journalist in a sleek black dress, stood near the front, her pen scratching furiously on a notepad. She had caught Eleanor's barbed words, her eyes narrowing as she sensed a story. Michelle noticed her, a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. Clara's presence was a lifeline, a chance that someone might see beyond the lies. But hope was fleeting. Eleanor's shadow loomed larger, her intent clear. The matriarch stepped closer, her pearl choker glinting like a noose. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice low but caring, each word a dart aimed at Michelle's heart. The crowd leaned in, hungry for scandal, their whispers a rising tide. Michelle's breath hitched, her hand pressing harder against her belly. The baby's kick was a reminder of why she endured, why she stood tall despite the humiliation creeping up her spine. She met Eleanor's gaze, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I'm a Whitmore now," she said, loud enough for the nearest guest to hear. "You can't erase that." Eleanor's smile tightened, a crack in her perfect facade. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the matriarch's next move. Vanessa's hand tightened on Michelle's arm, a silent warning, but Michelle pulled free, her satin gown swaying with the motion. The orchestra struck a new note, a haunting violin that seemed to underscore the tension. Eleanor raised her glass, the red wine inside catching the light like blood. "To purity," she said, her eyes locked on Michelle, "and to those who fail it." The toast was a dagger, and the crowd's polite applause felt like a chorus of betrayal. Michelle's heart pounded, her skin prickling with the weight of their judgment. She was a black woman, a mother-to-be, standing in a world that wanted her to kneel. But she wouldn't. Not tonight. Not ever. As Eleanor stepped closer, her intent clear, Michelle braced herself, her hands still on her belly. The baby kicked again, a fierce little pulse that anchored her. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew she'd fight for herself, for her child, for the truth. And somewhere far from this glittering cage, her father's shadow stirred, a force of reckoning waiting to be unleashed. The air in the Grand Opal ballroom thickened, heavy with the scent of champagne and betrayal. Michelle stood frozen near the stage, her white satin gown shimmering under the chandelier's unforgiving glare, its delicate puff sleeves trembling with her pulse. Her hand rested on her 7-month pregnant belly, the soft kick of her unborn child, a lifeline amidst the sea of judging eyes. Eleanor Whitmore's toast still echoed, to purity, a venomous barb that had pierced Michelle's heart. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a swarm of whispers stinging like wasps. She felt their gazes, sharp and unrelenting, stripping her bare, before a single thread of her dress had been touched. Her long, straight hair fell like a shield down her back, but it couldn't protect her from the storm brewing in Eleanor's icy stare. Vanessa Reed, Eleanor's assistant, lingered at her side, her crimson gown a stark warning against Michelle's pristine white. "Don't make this harder," Vanessa whispered, her voice a blade cloaked in silk, her fingers digging into Michelle's elbow. Michelle yanked her arm free, her dark eyes flashing. "I'm not your pawn," she said, her voice low but firm, a spark of defiance igniting in her chest. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if urging her to stand tall. But the weight of the room pressed down, each glance from the elite guests a reminder of her place. An outsider, a black woman who had dared to claim a stake in the Whitmore legacy. Eleanor descended the stage steps, her silver gown trailing like a predator's tail, her pearl choker glinting like a noose. The orchestra's violin faltered, its notes swallowed by the crowd's expectant hush. Michelle's breath hitched as Eleanor stopped before her, close enough for her perfume, sharp, floral, suffocating to fill the air. "Michelle," Eleanor said, her voice loud enough to carry, "you've brought shame to our name." The accusation landed like a slap, and the crowd leaned in, their champagne flutes forgotten. Michelle's heart pounded, her nails biting into her palms. She wanted to scream the truth, that the art charity scandal was a lie, orchestrated by Eleanor to protect the Whitmore fortune from her child's claim. But her throat tightened, the words trapped by fear and fury. Daniel Whitmore stood a few paces away, his tuxedo crisp but his posture weak. His eyes met Michelle's, a flicker of guilt passing through them, but he remained rooted, a statue of indecision. She had once believed in his love, in the promises whispered under starlit nights. Now his silence was a betrayal deeper than any wound. "Daniel," she whispered, barely audible, a plea for him to stand by her. He took a half-step forward, his mouth opening, but Eleanor's sharp glance stopped him cold. "Stay out of this," she snapped, and Daniel retreated, his head bowing in shame. Michelle's chest burned, a raw ache spreading as her husband abandoned her to his mother's wrath. Eleanor raised her glass of red wine, the liquid catching the light like spilled blood. "Some stains," she said, her smile a razor. "Can't be hidden." Before Michelle could react, Eleanor flung the wine, a crimson arc splashing across the white satin of her gown. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that echoed in the cavernous hall. The stain spread, a scarlet wound against the fabric, but Eleanor wasn't done. With a sneer, she seized the neckline of Michelle's dress with both hands and tore downward, the satin ripping with a sickening screech. The gown split from chest to belly, revealing Michelle's pregnant curve, exposed and vulnerable under the chandelier's glare. Shards of satin fell to the marble floor, a tattered ruin of elegance. "You fraud!" Eleanor bellowed, her voice echoing through the stunned silence. "You don't belong in our world!" The crowd's whispers erupted into a roar, a cacophony of shock and judgment. Michelle staggered back, her arms instinctively wrapping around her exposed belly, the baby's kicks a frantic rhythm against her hands. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You have no right," she shouted, her voice cracking but fierce, her dark eyes blazing with a fire that silenced the nearest guests. The room spun, the chandelier's prisms blurring into a kaleidoscope of light. But Michelle stood tall, her torn gown a badge of defiance. Chloe, a young server in a black uniform, hovered near the buffet, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. Hidden behind a floral arrangement, she had started recording the moment Eleanor raised her glass, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. Her heart pounded, fear and empathy warring within her. She saw herself in Michelle, a woman fighting to be seen, to be heard. The audio captured Eleanor's venom, Michelle's defiance, and the crowd's cruel murmurs. Chloe's breath caught as a guest's elbow knocked a champagne flute to the floor, the shattering glass slicing through the tension like a gunshot. Heads turned, and for a fleeting moment, Michelle's eyes met Chloe's, a silent plea passing between them. Clara Vaughn, the journalist, stood at the room's edge, her pen frozen mid-note. Her sharp eyes narrowed as she absorbed the scene, her notepad filled with fragments of Eleanor's words. She sensed a story, one that could topple empires. "Mrs. Whitmore," Clara called out, her voice cutting through the din, "why humiliate your daughter-in-law in public?" The question hung like a guillotine, and the crowd's murmurs spiked, a wave of outrage swelling among a few women who turned to leave in protest. Eleanor's smile faltered, her composure cracking for a split second. "This is a family matter," she snapped, but her voice lacked its usual steel, betrayed by the tremor in her hand. Michelle's legs shook, the weight of her exposure threatening to buckle her knees. The torn satin clung to her skin, damp with wine and sweat, but she forced herself to stand straighter. She could feel the baby's kicks, a steady pulse urging her to fight. "I'm not your shame," she said, her voice rising above the crowd's din, each word a hammer striking at Eleanor's facade. "I'm a mother, a wife, and more than you'll ever allow." The room quieted, some guests shifting uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Michelle and Eleanor. Daniel's face paled, his hands clenching, but he remained silent, a coward in his mother's shadow. The betrayal cut deeper than the wine, sharper than the torn fabric. Vanessa stepped forward, her crimson gown a stark contrast to the chaos. "Enough," she hissed, her eyes darting to the crowd. "You're making a spectacle." But Michelle shook her head, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "No, Vanessa, they did." She pointed at Eleanor, her finger trembling but resolute. The crowd's whispers grew louder, a tide turning against the matriarch. Clara scribbled furiously, her pen a weapon poised to strike. Chloe, still hidden, stopped the recording, her hands shaking as she slipped the phone into her apron, knowing the audio could change everything. Eleanor's face tightened, her pearl choker seeming to choke her as the room's attention shifted. She had meant to break Michelle, to cast her out as an unworthy intruder. But Michelle's defiance, her refusal to crumble, was a spark that threatened to ignite a fire. The orchestra resumed, a tentative violin note cutting through the haze. But the music couldn't drown out the truth. Michelle took a step back, her torn gown swaying, her belly a proud declaration of life amidst the ruin. She didn't know how she'd face the next moment, but she knew she wouldn't bow. Not to Eleanor, not to the crowd, not to the lies that sought to define her. As she turned to leave, the crowd parting like a reluctant sea, Michelle felt a flicker of something new. Resolve, raw and unyielding. Somewhere beyond the glittering walls of the Grand Opal, her father Isaiah waited, a titan whose wrath was stirring. The night was far from over, and the battle had only just begun. The echoes of shattered glass still lingered in the Grand Opal ballroom, a jagged note cutting through the stunned silence that followed Michelle's public humiliation. Her white satin gown, now a tattered ruin, clung to her trembling frame, the exposed curve of her 7-month pregnant belly, a raw testament to her vulnerability. Michelle stood at the edge of the stage, her long, straight hair a dark curtain framing her tear-streaked face. Her dark eyes burned with defiance, but beneath them, a storm of shame and fury churned, threatening to drown her. The crowd's whispers swelled, a venomous tide of judgment and shock, their gazes pinning her like a butterfly to a board. She clutched the remnants of her dress, her fingers trembling against the damp, wine-stained satin, her baby's kicks a fierce reminder to hold fast. She was a black woman in a world that sought to break her, but she would not crumble. Not yet. Eleanor Whitmore stood tall, her silver gown shimmering with cold triumph, her pearl choker glinting like a crown of thorns. Her sneer lingered, a mask of victory, but a flicker of unease crossed her face as the crowd's murmurs grew sharper. Some guests averted their eyes, discomfort replacing their earlier curiosity, while others leaned forward, hungry for more scandal. Michelle felt their stares like knives, each one carving away at her dignity. She wanted to flee, to escape the suffocating weight of their judgment, but her feet remained rooted, her pride a fragile anchor. "I'm not your shame," she had declared, and those words now echoed in her mind, a mantra against the chaos. Her heart pounded, a frantic rhythm that matched the baby's kicks, urging her to fight for the life she carried. Daniel Whitmore hovered at the edge of the crowd, his tuxedo pristine, but his face ashen, his hands clenched and unclenched, a war raging within him. Michelle's gaze locked onto his, a silent plea for him to stand by her, to be the husband he had promised to be. For a moment his eyes softened, guilt and love warring in their depths. He took a step forward, his voice barely audible. "Mother, this is enough," he said, his words trembling with a courage he didn't fully possess. Eleanor's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing to slits. "You dare?" she hissed, her voice a whip that lashed him back into silence. Daniel's shoulders slumped, his gaze dropping to the floor, and Michelle's heart shattered anew. His cowardice was a wound deeper than Eleanor's cruelty, a betrayal that left her gasping for air. Clara Vaughn, the journalist, stood near the front, her sleek black dress a stark contrast to the opulence around her. Her pen flew across her notepad, capturing every word, every glance, every tremor in Eleanor's facade. She stepped forward, her voice clear and cutting. "Mrs. Whitmore, why would you humiliate your pregnant daughter-in-law in front of New York's elite?" The question sliced through the room, a guillotine blade that made the crowd gasp. A group of women near the back stood abruptly, their heels clicking as they stormed toward the exit, their faces tight with disgust. "Disgraceful," one muttered, her voice carrying. The tide was turning, and Eleanor's composure faltered, her hand tightening around her empty wineglass. "This is a private matter," she snapped, but her voice cracked, betraying her fear. Chloe, the young server, lingered near the buffet, her black uniform blending into the shadows. Her hands shook as she clutched her phone, the recording still running, capturing Eleanor's venom and Michelle's defiance. She had seen the pain in Michelle's eyes, a mirror of her own struggles as a woman fighting to be seen in a world that dismissed her. Her heart raced, fear battling with a fierce need to act. She didn't know what the recording would do, but she knew it was right. The crowd's outrage grew, a low hum that vibrated through the marble floor. Michelle felt it, a shift in the air, a crack in the Whitmore empire. Her tears burned, but she blinked them back, her chin lifting higher. She would not let them see her break. Across the city, in a Manhattan penthouse overlooking a glittering skyline, Isaiah Wells sat in his darkened study, the glow of a single lamp illuminating his stern features. A titan of technology, his presence filled the room even in solitude. His dark eyes sharp with a resolve forged in battles won. His phone rang, shattering the silence, and Clara Vaughn's voice came through, urgent and precise. "Mr. Wells, your daughter was just humiliated at the Whitmore Gala. Eleanor tore her dress in front of everyone, called her a fraud." Isaiah's hand tightened around the phone, his knuckles whitening. "They did what?" His voice was low, a growl that promised retribution. The image of Michelle, his only child, exposed and shamed, ignited a fire in his chest. He had been estranged from her since her marriage, his warnings about the Whitmores ignored. But now his absence felt like a failure he could not forgive. "Get me everything," Isaiah barked to his assistant, Marcus, who stood ready at the door. "Lawyers, investigators, every contact we have. They touch my daughter and they'll pay." His voice trembled, not with fear, but with a fury that could topple empires. He stood, his tailored suit a shadow against the city lights, and paced to the window. Michelle's face flashed in his mind, her strength, her grace, the daughter he had failed to protect. Guilt gnawed at him, a sharp ache that fueled his resolve. He hadn't been there when she needed him, but he would be now. The Whitmores had no idea the storm they had unleashed. Back at the gala, Michelle took a step toward the exit, her torn gown trailing like a battle flag. The crowd parted, some faces softening with pity, others hardened with judgment. She felt their eyes, their whispers, but she focused on the baby's kicks, each one a pulse of strength. "We're okay," she whispered to her child, her voice barely audible. Clara followed, her notepad tucked away, her eyes blazing with purpose. "Mrs. Whitmore," she called again, her voice louder. "Will you answer for this?" Eleanor spun, her face a mask of rage. "You're out of line," she hissed. But the crowd's murmurs drowned her out, a rising tide of dissent. The women who had left earlier stood outside, their voices carrying through the open doors, condemning Eleanor's cruelty. Vanessa moved to block Michelle's path, her crimson gown a barrier. "Don't make this worse," she warned, her eyes darting to the crowd. But Michelle pushed past, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You've already done your worst," she said, her words cutting through the din. The crowd's whispers grew louder, some guests pulling out phones to call contacts, spreading the story. Chloe slipped her phone into her apron, her recording complete, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. She didn't know where it would lead, but she knew it was for Michelle. Michelle reached the grand doors, the cool night air hitting her exposed skin like a balm. Her gown, once a symbol of elegance, was now a tattered reminder of her ordeal. She paused, her hand on her belly, feeling the baby's steady kicks. The pain of Daniel's betrayal, Eleanor's cruelty, and the crowd's judgment threatened to overwhelm her, but she clung to her resolve. She was more than their lies, more than their shame. Somewhere across the city, her father's wrath was stirring, a force that would shake the foundations of the Whitmore empire. As she stepped into the night, the city's lights glittering like a promise, Michelle knew this was not the end, but the beginning of her fight. The cool night air wrapped around Michelle like a fleeting embrace as she stepped out of the Grand Opal's gilded doors, her torn satin gown trailing behind her like a wounded flag. The city's lights glittered against the darkness, a stark contrast to the chaos she had just endured. Her hand rested on her 7-month pregnant belly, the baby's steady kicks anchoring her against the storm of humiliation still raging within. The crowd's whispers, Eleanor's venomous words, and Daniel's betrayal clung to her like the wine-stained remnants of her dress. Michelle's dark eyes, framed by her long, straight hair, shimmered with unshed tears. But her jaw was set, her resolve a burning ember in her chest. She was a black woman who had dared to love in a world that rejected her. And though her heart ached, she would not let it break. Not now. Not ever. Inside a sleek black car waiting at the curb, she sank into the leather seat, her breath shallow. The driver, a quiet man in Isaiah's employ, glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes soft with pity. "To the hospital, ma'am?" he asked gently. Michelle nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Please." Her fingers trembled as she clutched the tattered satin, the exposure of her belly before the gala crowd replaying in her mind. Each cruel word from Eleanor, fraud, cheap, cut deeper than the torn fabric. But the baby's kicks were a lifeline, a reminder of why she fought. She closed her eyes, whispering to her child, "We're stronger than their lies." The city blurred past, a kaleidoscope of lights that couldn't pierce the darkness in her heart. Across Manhattan, in the shadowed expanse of his penthouse, Isaiah Wells stood before a wall of windows, the city's skyline a glittering battlefield below. His tailored suit was a second skin, but his hands clenched into fists, his dark eyes blazing with a fury that could shatter glass. Clara Vaughn's call had ignited a fire within him, her words. Eleanor tore her dress in front of everyone, a spark that set his soul ablaze. Michelle, his daughter, his pride, had been humiliated, and he had not been there to shield her. The guilt was a knife, twisting in his chest, sharpened by years of distance since her marriage to Daniel. He had warned her about the Whitmores, their world of privilege and prejudice, but she had chosen love. Now that love had betrayed her, and Isaiah's heart burned with a vow. They would pay. "Marcus," he barked, his voice a low growl that filled the room. His assistant, a wiry man with sharp eyes, appeared instantly. "Get me the best investigators. I want every detail from that gala. Witnesses, recordings, anything. His gaze never left the skyline, each light a reminder of his empire, built from nothing, a testament to his unyielding will. And call my legal team. We're going to war. Marcus nodded, already dialing. Isaiah's mind raced, piecing together a strategy. He was a titan of technology, a black man who had clawed his way to power in a world that tried to keep him down. Now that power would be Michelle's shield, her sword. He would tear the Whitmore empire to the ground, brick by gilded brick. At the hospital, Michelle sat on a sterile bed, a thin blanket draped over her shoulders. The fluorescent lights buzzed, casting harsh shadows on her face. But the soft beeping of a fetal monitor brought a flicker of calm. Her baby was safe, strong, its heartbeat a steady rhythm against her fear. A nurse, her voice gentle, checked Michelle's vitals, her eyes lingering on the wine-stained torn gown. "You're okay, sweetheart," she said, her hand brushing Michelle's. "You're tougher than you know." Michelle managed a small smile, but her heart was heavy, the weight of Daniel's silence crushing her. She had hoped for his defense, for the man who once promised her forever, but he had chosen his mother's shadow over her light. The betrayal was a wound she couldn't bandage, a pain that throbbed with every breath. The hospital door swung open, and Isaiah strode in, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. His dark eyes softened as they met Michelle's, but the fury beneath was unmistakable. "My girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion, crossing the room in 3 strides. He knelt beside her, his hand hovering before gently touching her shoulder. "I should have been there." The words carried a weight of years, of arguments and distance, of a father who had let pride stand between them. Michelle's throat tightened, tears spilling over despite her resolve. "You're here now," she whispered, her voice cracking. The baby kicked, a small bridge between them, and Isaiah's eyes glistened, a rare crack in his stoic facade. "I won't fail you again," he vowed, his voice low but fierce, a promise etched in stone. Back at the gala, the air was thick with dissent. Clara Vaughn stood among the remaining guests, her notepad filled with furious scribbles. She had cornered a group of women who had walked out, their voices sharp with outrage. "Eleanor went too far," one said, her diamond bracelet glinting as she gestured. "Humiliating a pregnant woman like that. It's unforgivable." Clara nodded, her mind already crafting a headline that would shake New York's elite. She slipped away, dialing her editor. "This is bigger than a scandal," she said. "It's a reckoning." The story was spreading, whispers turning into a roar, and the Whitmore name, once untouchable, began to fray at the edges. Chloe, the server, lingered in the service corridor, her hands still trembling as she clutched her phone. The recording was safe, Eleanor's venom captured in every word. She had acted on instinct, driven by the pain in Michelle's eyes, a pain she knew too well as a woman often overlooked. Her heart pounded, fear and resolve warring within her. She didn't know how to get the recording to the right hands, but she knew it mattered. Slipping into the kitchen, she found a quiet corner and sent the file to Clara, her fingers shaking as she typed a brief message. For Michelle, the act felt like a rebellion, a small spark that could ignite a fire. Isaiah's team moved like a well-oiled machine. In his penthouse, investigators pored over witness statements, while hackers traced the source of the gossip column that had branded Michelle a fraud. They uncovered a trail leading to Vanessa Reed, Eleanor's assistant, who had paid a blogger to plant the lie. The discovery was a match to gasoline, fueling Isaiah's rage. He stood at his desk, a financial report in hand, detailing the Whitmore Empire's vulnerabilities. "Buy their loans," he ordered Marcus, his voice cold as steel. "Every weak asset they own. Freeze their accounts." His eyes burned with purpose, each word a step toward dismantling the family that had dared to touch his daughter. The Whitmores had built their fortune on power, but Isaiah's was forged in resilience, and he would use it to crush them. Michelle lay back on the hospital bed, the blanket pulled tight around her. The memory of the gala, Eleanor's sneer, the crowd's whispers, Daniel's silence, played like a cruel loop in her mind. But Isaiah's presence beside her was a lifeline, his vow a shield against the pain. "They thought they could break me," she said, her voice soft but steady, her hand on her belly. "But they don't know who I am." Isaiah's hand covered hers, his grip firm. "They'll learn," he said, his voice a low rumble, a promise of retribution that echoed in the sterile room. The baby kicked, a fierce little pulse, and Michelle felt a spark of hope. She was not alone. Outside, the city hummed, oblivious to the war brewing. The Whitmore name, once a beacon of prestige, was cracking under the weight of their own cruelty. Clara's article was already in motion, set to hit the presses by morning, and Chloe's recording was a ticking bomb in her hands. Isaiah's shadow loomed larger, a titan ready to strike. Michelle closed her eyes, the hospital's hum fading, her heart steadying with the baby's rhythm. She had faced the worst and survived. Now, with her father by her side, she would rise. The sterile hum of the hospital room faded into memory as Michelle stepped into the New York courthouse, a cavernous chamber of polished wood and cold justice. Her white dress, simple now, no longer the tattered satin of that brutal night, clung softly to her frame, the faint curve of her post-pregnancy body, a quiet testament to her new role as a mother. Caleb, her newborn son, was safe with a nurse, but his presence lingered in her heart, each beat a reminder of why she stood here. Her long, straight hair framed her face, her dark eyes burning with a fire forged in humiliation and resolve. The air was thick with anticipation, the packed gallery buzzing with whispers as reporters scribbled and cameras flashed. Michelle's chest tightened, the weight of the gala's shame still heavy, but she lifted her chin, her gaze steady. She was no longer the woman exposed under chandelier light. She was a warrior, ready to face the Whitmore's ruin. Eleanor Whitmore sat at the defendant's table, her silver hair immaculate, her tailored suit a pale echo of her gala grandeur. Her face was a mask of defiance, but her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly as they clutched a pen. Beside her, Vanessa Reed, her assistant, shifted nervously, her crimson lipstick faded under the courtroom's harsh glare. Daniel Whitmore sat apart, his tuxedo replaced by a plain suit, his eyes hollow, avoiding Michelle's gaze. The betrayal of his silence at the gala still stung, a raw wound that pulsed with every glance. Michelle's heart ached, not for love lost, but for the man she thought he was, now reduced to a shadow of his mother's making. The gallery's murmurs grew, a restless tide, but Michelle focused on the judge's gavel, its sharp crack silencing the room. The prosecutor, a woman with steel in her eyes, called Michelle to the stand. Her heels clicked against the floor, each step a defiance of the shame that had tried to break her. She swore the oath, her voice steady, though her hands trembled against the wooden railing. "They tore my dress before hundreds," she began, her words cutting through the silence. "Called me a fraud, a liar, to protect their fortune." Her eyes locked on Eleanor, unflinching. "They wanted to erase me, but I'm still here." The gallery stirred, a ripple of sympathy and outrage. Michelle's throat tightened, the memory of the gala. Eleanor's sneer, the wine splashing, the satin ripping, flooding back. Her baby's kicks had kept her strong then, and Caleb's existence fueled her now. She would not falter, not for them, not for anyone. The prosecutor played Chloe's recording, the server's secret weapon from that night. Eleanor's voice filled the courtroom, venomous and clear. "You don't belong here." The words, followed by Michelle's defiant cry, "You have no right," struck like lightning. The gallery gasped, reporters scribbling furiously. Chloe, now on the stand, her black uniform replaced by a modest dress, spoke softly but firmly. "I saw her pain," she said, her voice trembling. "I couldn't stay silent." Her eyes met Michelle's, a shared strength passing between them. Two women who had defied the odds. Michelle's heart swelled, gratitude mingling with her resolve. Chloe's courage had given her a voice when the world tried to silence her. Then came the unexpected blow. The prosecutor called Lydia Harper, a former assistant to Eleanor, her face pale but resolute. "Mrs. Whitmore ordered the smear campaign," Lydia said, her voice steady despite Eleanor's glare. "She paid to spread lies about Michelle to block her child's inheritance." Lydia produced documents, financial records showing Eleanor's embezzlement from the Whitmore charity to fund the gossip column. The courtroom erupted, the judge's gavel pounding for order. Michelle's breath caught, the weight of Eleanor's cruelty laid bare. She glanced at Isaiah, seated in the front row, his dark eyes blazing with a quiet triumph. He had orchestrated this, his investigators unearthing Lydia's testimony, a dagger to the Whitmore Empire's heart. Eleanor shot to her feet, her composure shattering. "I protected my family," she shouted, her voice raw with desperation. "She's a threat to our legacy." The judge's gavel slammed again, but Eleanor's outburst hung in the air, a confession of intent. Vanessa shrank in her seat, her face ashen, while Daniel's head bowed lower, his hands clenched in shame. Michelle's heart twisted, not for Eleanor's downfall, but for the man who had once been her husband, now a stranger lost in his mother's shadow. She wanted to hate him, but pity crept in, a bitter ache that made her look away. Isaiah's presence was a steady anchor, his tailored suit a silent declaration of power. He hadn't spoken, but his gaze spoke volumes, fury, pride, and a father's unwavering love. Michelle felt it, a warmth that eased the chill of the courtroom. He had failed her once, but now he was her shield, his empire a weapon against those who dared to harm her. She remembered his words in the hospital, "I won't fail you again," and they steadied her, a vow that carried her through this moment. Her fingers brushed the edge of the stand, grounding her as she faced the gallery, their eyes no longer judging but awed. The prosecutor pressed forward, presenting financial records that detailed Eleanor's theft, each page a nail in the Whitmore coffin. "This was no accident," she said, her voice cutting. "It was a calculated attack on a pregnant woman." The gallery's murmurs grew, a tide of outrage swelling. Michelle's chest tightened, the memory of her exposed belly under the gala's lights burning fresh. But she was not that woman anymore. She was a mother, a survivor, and her voice had power. She spoke again, her words clear. "They thought they could break me," she said, her eyes sweeping the courtroom. "But they only broke themselves." Daniel's gaze finally met hers, a flicker of regret in his hollow eyes. "Michelle," he whispered, barely audible, but she turned away, her heart hardened. He had chosen silence when she needed him most, and that choice was a wound that wouldn't heal. Eleanor's face was a mask of fury, her hands trembling as she realized her empire was crumbling. Vanessa's eyes darted, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The judge's voice cut through, announcing the charges: assault, fraud, and public endangerment for Eleanor, aiding and abetting for Vanessa, complicity for Daniel. The gavel fell, a thunderclap sealing their fate. Michelle stepped down from the stand, her legs steady despite the weight of the moment. Isaiah rose, his hand brushing hers as she passed, a silent promise of strength. The gallery's whispers followed her, but they were different now. Admiration, not judgment. Clara Vaughn, the journalist, stood near the exit, her notepad filled, her eyes alight with the story she'd tell. Michelle felt a spark of hope, a belief that her truth would outshine the lies. Caleb's face flashed in her mind, his tiny hands a reminder of what she fought for. She was more than the Whitmore's shame. She was a force, unbroken, unbowed. As she reached the courthouse doors, the city's hum greeted her, a vibrant pulse that matched her own. The trial wasn't over, but this moment was hers. She had faced the Whitmores, their lies, their cruelty, and emerged stronger. Isaiah's shadow loomed behind her, a titan ready to finish what he started. The world was watching, and Michelle was ready to speak. The courthouse doors swung shut behind Michelle, their heavy thud a final echo of the trial's weight, but the air outside carried a new clarity, sharp and cleansing. She stood on the steps, her simple white dress swaying in the breeze, a far cry from the tattered satin that had marked her humiliation. Her long, straight hair caught the city's glow, framing her face where defiance and exhaustion wrestled. Caleb, her newborn son, was safe with a nurse, but his tiny presence pulsed in her heart, a beacon through the storm of betrayal and shame. The memory of Eleanor's venom, Daniel's silence, and the courtroom's reckoning lingered, but Michelle's dark eyes held a new fire, not of anger, but of purpose. She was a black woman who had faced a world that tried to break her, and now, with her father's strength behind her, she was ready to rebuild. In a quiet hospital room across the city, Michelle sat propped against pillows, the soft beeping of a monitor weaving a lullaby for Caleb, cradled in her arms. His tiny face, a blend of her features and a hope she couldn't name, was a miracle that softened the edges of her pain. The fluorescent lights cast a gentle glow, a stark contrast to the chandelier's harsh glare at the gala. Her fingers traced Caleb's cheek, his warmth grounding her as memories of the trial flooded back. Eleanor's outburst, Daniel's hollow eyes, the gavel's thunder. Her heart ached, not for the Whitmore's downfall, but for the woman she had been, the one who believed love could bridge worlds. Now she knew better. Love hadn't saved her. Her own strength had. Isaiah Wells stood by the window, his tailored suit a silhouette against the city's skyline. His dark eyes, usually sharp with resolve, softened as they lingered on Michelle and Caleb. The guilt of his absence during her marriage to Daniel gnawed at him, a wound that deepened with every glance at his daughter. He had torn down the Whitmore empire, freezing their assets, exposing their lies, but victory felt hollow without her healing. "You're a mother now," he said, his voice low, thick with emotion. "Stronger than I ever was." Michelle looked up, her eyes glistening. "I learned from you," she said, her voice soft but steady, "even when you weren't there." The words stung, but they were a bridge, mending the years of distance between them. The hospital room was a sanctuary, its quiet a balm after the courtroom's chaos. Michelle's thoughts drifted to Chloe, the server whose recording had shifted the tide. She hadn't seen her since the trial, but the memory of Chloe's trembling hands, her quiet courage, was a spark in Michelle's heart. She wanted to do more than survive. She wanted to give others the voice she had fought to reclaim. "I'm starting something," she told Isaiah, her voice firm despite the exhaustion weighing her down. "A place for women like me, women who've been silenced." Isaiah's eyes widened, pride flickering through his stoicism. "Whatever you need," he said, his hand brushing hers. "But it's yours to build." The idea had taken root in the courtroom, born from the ashes of her humiliation. She called it Luminous, a foundation to support women crushed by shame or lies, to teach them to stand tall. Michelle's fingers tightened around Caleb, his soft breaths fueling her resolve. She saw herself in every woman who had been dismissed, degraded, or erased, and she would be their shield. The gala's cruelty, Eleanor's wine-soaked sneer, the crowd's whispers, had tried to define her, but it had only forged her purpose. Her heart swelled, a mix of pain and hope, as she imagined a world where no woman stood alone under a chandelier's glare. Chloe appeared at the hospital door, her modest dress a far cry from her server's uniform. Her eyes were bright but nervous, clutching a small bouquet of white lilies. "I heard about Caleb," she said, her voice trembling. "I wanted to see you." Michelle smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "You gave me a voice, Chloe," she said, her eyes meeting the young woman's. "That recording, it changed everything." Chloe's cheeks flushed, her hands fidgeting. I saw myself in you," she admitted. "Someone who deserved better." The confession hung between them, a bond forged in shared defiance. Michelle reached out, squeezing Chloe's hand, feeling the weight of their shared strength. The room filled with a quiet energy as Chloe sat beside her, the lilies a soft contrast to the sterile white walls. Michelle shared her vision for Luminous, her words spilling out with a passion that surprised her. "It's not just about surviving," she said, her voice rising. "It's about thriving, about giving women the tools to fight back." Chloe nodded, her eyes alight. "I want to help," she said, her voice steadier now. "I know what it's like to feel invisible." Michelle's heart ached with gratitude, the pain of the gala fading against this new purpose. Caleb stirred, his tiny hand curling around her finger, and she felt a surge of love so fierce it nearly undid her. Isaiah watched in silence, his stoic facade cracking as he saw his daughter's fire. He had spent his life building an empire, but Michelle was building something greater, a legacy of light. He stepped closer, his voice low. "I'll fund it," he said, "but it's your name on the door." Michelle shook her head, her eyes fierce. "No, Dad, it's not about names. It's about them, the women who need us." Isaiah's throat tightened, pride swelling in his chest. He had torn down the Whitmores, but Michelle was building a world where no one could do to others what had been done to her. Outside, the city hummed, its rhythm a backdrop to the quiet revolution in the hospital room. Clara Vaughn, the journalist, was already drafting her article, her words poised to amplify Michelle's story. The Whitmore name was crumbling, their empire fraying under the weight of their own cruelty. But Michelle's focus was inward, on Caleb, on Luminous, on the women she would lift up. The gala's shame had tried to break her, but it had only shaped her. She looked at Caleb, his tiny breaths a promise of tomorrow, and felt a spark of hope ignite. She was no longer the woman who stood exposed under the chandelier's glare. She was a mother, a warrior, a light. Chloe lingered, sharing stories of her own struggles, her voice growing stronger with each word. Michelle listened, her heart opening to the possibility of change. The pain of Daniel's betrayal still lingered, a dull ache in her chest, but it no longer defined her. She thought of Eleanor's venom, Vanessa's complicity, and the crowd's whispers, but they were shadows now, fading against Caleb's warmth. "We're going to change things," she said, her voice steady, her eyes on Chloe. "For us, for them, for him." Caleb's tiny hand tightened, a silent agreement, and Michelle smiled, a real smile, the first in what felt like forever. Isaiah stepped to the door, giving them space, his eyes lingering on his daughter. He had fought for her in court, but this was her battle, her triumph. The city outside pulsed with life, its lights a canvas for Michelle's new beginning. She held Caleb closer, his heartbeat syncing with hers, and felt the weight of her past lift, if only a little. The world had tried to silence her, but she had found her voice, and it would echo far beyond the hospital walls. The hospital's quiet hum faded into memory, replaced by the soft rustle of papers and the scent of fresh paint in the modest office of the Luminous Foundation. Michelle sat at a wooden desk, her long, straight hair pulled back, a stark contrast to the flowing cascade that had framed her during the gala's brutal night. Her simple blouse hugged her post-pregnancy frame, a reminder of Caleb, now napping in a crib nearby, his tiny breaths a rhythm that steadied her heart. The weight of the Whitmore trial lingered, Eleanor's venom, Daniel's betrayal, the courtroom's thunder, but it no longer defined her. Michelle's dark eyes, once clouded with shame, now burned with purpose, a fire kindled by the pain she had endured. She was a black woman who had faced a world intent on breaking her, and in its ashes, she was building a sanctuary for others. The office was a haven of light, its pale walls adorned with sketches of women standing tall, their silhouettes a promise of resilience. Michelle's fingers traced a letter on her desk, its edges worn, the handwriting jagged but deliberate. It was from Eleanor, penned from the cold confines of a prison cell. "I thought power was control," it read, "but you showed me its compassion. I'm sorry for what I did." The words pierced Michelle, a strange mix of pity and defiance swirling in her chest. She wanted to crumple the letter, to let it fall like the tattered satin of her gala gown, but something held her back. Eleanor's regret was a shadow, not a chain. Michelle's heart ached, not for the woman who had humiliated her, but for the part of herself that had once sought approval from a world that rejected her. She set the letter aside, her gaze drifting to Caleb, his tiny hands curled in sleep. His presence was a balm, soothing the raw edges of her pain. The gala's cruelty, Eleanor's wine-soaked sneer, the crowd's whispers, Daniel's silence, still haunted her dreams. But Caleb's soft breaths pulled her back to the present. She was a mother now, and that role gave her strength beyond the courtroom's victory. Her fingers trembled as she recalled the trial, Chloe's recording, and Lydia's testimony, but she pushed the memories down. She wasn't here to dwell on the past. She was here to forge a future. Luminous was her vow, a beacon for women whose voices had been stolen, just as hers had been. Chloe stepped into the office, her modest dress a far cry from her server's uniform, her eyes bright with a nervous energy. She carried a stack of flyers for Luminous's first workshop, her hands steady despite the weight of her new role as program coordinator. "Michelle," she said, her voice soft but firm, "we've got a dozen women signed up already." Michelle's heart swelled, gratitude flooding her. Chloe's courage at the gala, her secret recording, had given Michelle a lifeline, and now they were building something together. You're making this real, Michelle said, her voice thick with emotion. She reached for Chloe's hand, their fingers clasping in a bond forged in shared defiance. I saw you that night, Chloe admitted, her eyes glistening. I saw me in you, someone who deserved better. The confession hung between them, a thread of understanding that wove their pain into purpose. Michelle's throat tightened, memories of her own struggles, being the only black woman in rooms of privilege, fighting to be seen, mirroring Chloe's words. She wanted to cry, but instead she smiled, a fierce, radiant curve that lit the room. We're giving them better, she said, her voice steady now. Every woman who walks through that door will know she's not alone. Caleb stirred, a soft coo breaking the silence, and Michelle's heart ached with love so fierce it nearly undid her. She was building Luminous for him, too, for a world where he'd never know the shame she had endured. Isaiah entered quietly, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the office's simplicity. His dark eyes, usually sharp with resolve, softened as they landed on Michelle and Caleb. The guilt of his absence during her marriage still gnawed at him, a wound he carried silently. He had torn down the Whitmores, freezing their assets, exposing their lies. But Michelle's strength humbled him. You're doing something I never could, he said, his voice low, almost reverent. Michelle looked up, her eyes meeting his. I learned from you, she said, her words a bridge across their years of distance. You fought for me when I couldn't. Isaiah's throat tightened, his hand brushing Caleb's crib, a rare vulnerability in his stoic frame. The office buzzed with quiet energy as volunteers moved through, preparing for the workshop. One woman, Elena, lingered near the door, her eyes shadowed but hopeful. She had come to Luminous after escaping a marriage that mirrored Michelle's pain. Public shame, whispered lies. I heard your story, Elena said, her voice trembling. It gave me the courage to leave. Michelle's heart stopped, a flood of emotions, pride, pain, purpose, washing over her. She stood crossing to Elena and took her hands. You're why I'm here, she said, her voice thick. You're not alone anymore. Elena's eyes filled with tears, and Michelle felt her own sting, a shared strength binding them. The letter from Eleanor lay forgotten on the desk, its words fading against the reality of Luminous. Michelle didn't hate her, not anymore. Hate was a chain, and she had broken free. She thought of Daniel, his hollow eyes at the trial, his whispered regret that came too late. The pain of his betrayal lingered, a dull ache, but it no longer held her captive. She was more than the wife he had failed, more than the woman Eleanor had shamed. She was a mother, a leader, a light. Caleb's soft coo pulled her back, his tiny hand reaching for her finger, and she smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. He was her future, her reason, her fire. Isaiah watched, his silence a testament to his pride. He had fought for her in the courtroom, but this, Luminous, Caleb, Michelle's unbreakable spirit, was her victory. Don't let their shadows dim you, he said, his voice low but fierce. Michelle nodded, her eyes on Caleb. They won't, she said, her voice steady. I'm done with shadows. The office hummed with life, volunteers moving with purpose, Elena's story echoing in Michelle's heart. She was building something bigger than herself, a sanctuary where pain became power. The gala's cruelty, the crowd's whispers, were distant now, drowned out by the light she was creating. Chloe handed Michelle a flyer, her smile tentative but bright. This is just the start, she said, her voice carrying a new confidence. Michelle took it, her fingers brushing the bold letters. Luminous, reclaim your voice. Her heart swelled, a mix of hope and resolve. She thought of the women like Elena, like Chloe, like herself, who had faced worlds that tried to silence them. They would rise together, their voices a chorus that could not be ignored. Caleb's eyes opened, dark and curious like hers, and Michelle felt a surge of love so fierce it anchored her. The city outside pulsed, its lights a canvas for Michelle's new beginning. She stood, cradling Caleb, her gaze sweeping the office. The letter from Eleanor was a relic, its regret meaningless against the fire in her heart. She was no longer the woman who stood exposed under a chandelier's glare. She was a mother, a warrior, a beacon. Luminous was her promise, and she would keep it. The soft hum of the Luminous Foundation's office faded, replaced by the vibrant pulse of the Grand Opal ballroom, transformed from a stage of shame into a beacon of hope. Michelle stood at the center of the gala, no longer in the tattered satin of that brutal night, but in a flowing white gown, its simple elegance a quiet defiance. Her long, straight hair cascaded down her back, catching the chandelier's warm glow, her dark eyes alight with a fire that had grown from pain to purpose. Caleb, now a toddling spark of joy, was safe with a nurse, but his presence fueled her, a heartbeat echoing in her chest. The crowd before her, survivors, advocates, allies, watched with reverence, not judgment, their applause a soft thunder that drowned out the ghosts of whispers past. Michelle was a black woman who had faced a world intent on breaking her, and now she was its architect, rebuilding it with light. The ballroom, once a glittering cage of cruelty, was alive with warmth, its marble floors reflecting candlelight instead of cold opulence. Tables held cards proclaiming luminous, reclaim your voice, a vow Michelle had made real. Her heart swelled as she stepped to the podium, the weight of Eleanor's venom, Daniel's betrayal, and the gala's shame now distant shadows. She was no longer the woman exposed under these same chandeliers. She was a mother, a leader, a force. Her fingers trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of what she had built. The crowd hushed, their eyes fixed on her, and Michelle felt their hope, a tide lifting her higher. She was here for them, for Caleb, for the woman she had become. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michelle began, her voice clear, resonating with a strength forged in fire. "This room once held my darkest moment. They tore my dress, my dignity, before your eyes. But pain isn't an end. It's a beginning." Her words carried a quiet power, each syllable a brick in the foundation she had laid. The crowd leaned in, some eyes glistening, others nodding in recognition. Michelle's throat tightened, the memory of Eleanor's sneer, the wine splashing, the satin ripping, flickering like a dying ember. But Caleb's face, his tiny hands, anchored her. "Luminous is for every woman who's been silenced," she continued, her voice rising. "We don't just survive, we shine." The applause erupted, a wave that crashed against the walls, and Michelle's heart soared, a mix of pride and purpose. Eleanor, the woman whose story had touched Michelle in the Foundation's early days, stood near the front, her eyes bright with tears. She had escaped a marriage of lies and shame, finding refuge in Luminous's workshops. Now she was a volunteer, her presence a testament to Michelle's vision. "You gave me a voice," Eleanor had told her, and those words echoed in Michelle's mind as she scanned the crowd. Other women joined Elena on stage, their faces a mosaic of resilience, some scarred, some smiling, all unbroken. "I was shamed for speaking out," one said, her voice trembling but strong. "Luminous taught me I'm enough." The crowd's applause swelled, and Michelle's chest ached with a love so fierce it nearly undid her. These women were her why, her fire. Isaiah Wells stood at the room's edge, his tailored suit a shadow against the candlelight. His dark eyes, once sharp with fury, now gleamed with pride, softened by a father's love. He had torn down the Whitmore empire, freezing their assets, exposing their lies. But this moment was Michelle's. He hadn't sought the spotlight, hadn't claimed credit for the funds that fueled Luminous. His role was quiet, a silent vow to protect her light. "You taught me what power really is," he said later, his voice low, almost reverent, as he handed her a single white rose. Michelle smiled, her eyes glistening. "You gave me the chance to learn," she replied, their bond a bridge rebuilt from years of distance. Isaiah's throat tightened, his hand lingering on hers, a father humbled by his daughter's strength. Chloe, now the Foundation's program coordinator, moved through the crowd, her modest dress replaced by a soft blue gown that mirrored her newfound confidence. She had been the server who recorded Eleanor's cruelty, her trembling hands giving Michelle a voice when none seemed possible. Now she guided volunteers, her smile radiant as she introduced a new initiative, a hotline for women facing public shame. "This is for you," Chloe whispered to Michelle, her eyes bright. Michelle squeezed her hand, gratitude flooding her. "It's for us," she said, her voice thick. The bond between them, forged in that night of pain, was now a cornerstone of Luminous, a testament to what courage could build. The crowd included former Whitmore allies, their faces solemn, some approaching Michelle with quiet apologies. "We stood by that night," one woman said, her voice breaking. "We should have done more." Michelle met her gaze, her heart torn between pain and compassion. "You're here now," she said softly, her words a bridge over the past. "That's enough." The woman nodded, tears falling, and Michelle felt a weight lift. Not forgiveness for Eleanor, but freedom from the gala's shadow. Daniel's face flashed in her mind, his hollow eyes at the trial, but she pushed it away. He was a ghost, not her future. Caleb was her future. Luminous was her purpose, and this room was her triumph. The orchestra played a gentle melody, its notes weaving through the crowd's applause. Michelle's gaze swept the room, landing on a young woman in the back, her eyes wide with hope, clutching a luminous flyer. She reminded Michelle of herself, alone, judged, but unbroken. "This is for you," Michelle said, her voice carrying to the woman, to every woman in the room. "You are not your shame. You are light." The crowd rose, their applause a thunder that shook the chandeliers, and Michelle's heart pounded, a mix of joy and resolve. She had turned the place of her darkest night into a sanctuary, a stage for voices once silenced. Isaiah stepped closer, his presence a quiet strength. "Your mother would have been proud," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Michelle's eyes stung, the memory of her mother, a woman who fought her own battles, merging with her own journey. "She's here," she said, her hand on her heart, Caleb's image anchoring her. The gala continued, laughter and hope replacing the whispers of that cruel night. Volunteers shared stories, donors pledged support, and the room pulsed with life. Michelle felt it all, a tide of love and purpose that carried her higher than any pain could reach. As the night wound down, Michelle stepped to the balcony, the city's light stretching before her like a sea of stars. She was no longer the woman who had stood exposed, her gown in tatters, her dignity under siege. She was a mother, a beacon, a force. The crowd's cheers echoed behind her, a chorus of resilience. She whispered to Caleb, to the women of Luminous, to herself, "We shine." The city hummed, its rhythm a promise of tomorrow, and Michelle stood tall, her light unquenchable. Michelle's journey, from a night of shattering humiliation to a beacon of hope, lights a path for us all. Her courage, forged in pain, reminds us that strength rises from the ashes of shame. What did her story stir in you? A spark of defiance, a call to stand tall, or a dream of justice? Share your thoughts, your stories, with those who need to hear them. Thank you for walking this path with Michelle, for feeling her fire. Stay with us for more tales of resilience and redemption, where voices once silenced roar. Until we meet again, keep shining.